October 1852. Millard Fillmore was the President of the United States. Isaac Singer had just patented his sewing machine. Charles Darwin was still writing about natural selection. Vincent van Gogh wouldn't even be born for another 5 months. And the city of Albany was making headlines across the nation as First Congregational Church hosted an international convention that almost nobody remembers today. So let's back up a bit. Today you hear the words Congregational Church, and you think, hey, that must be pretty new, like from the 50s or something, right? Nope. The Congregational Church actually came over with the Pilgrims on the Mayflower in 1620. That whole concept of throwing off the pageantry and focusing on the basics, yep, that was us. And by the 1800s, Congregationalism had grown so popular that there were Congregational churches all over New England. In fact, in the year 1800, Congregationalism was the official church of Connecticut, Massachusetts, and New Hampshire. Why the growing popularity? One of the reasons is because the Congregational Church was founded on ideals of democracy. The same ideals of democracy shared by the Founding Fathers, the Declaration of Independence, and the U.S. Constitution, to name a few. Because unlike many denominations where individual churches are run by an external body of bishops, or a committee of clergy, or even a single pope overseas, the Congregational Church is run by the actual members of that congregation who vote on everything from building improvements to selection of the minister, hence Congregational. But with each church acting independently, how can you be sure that every Congregational church believes in the same things? Does a church in Boston stand for the same things as the church in New York? Maybe, maybe not. And to complicate things even more, the Congregational churches in New England partnered with the Presbyterian churches in the Plan of Union of 1801. Among other things, this meant that the ministers of one denomination could be hired by the other denomination, and then choose whether to be governed by a council of elders from the Presbyterian church or use a congregational model of self-governance. Well, that worked for a while, but soon the waters were getting muddied, and eventually the Congregational Board for establishing new Congregational churches was mostly made up of Presbyterians, who were setting up Presbyterian churches, not Congregational churches. And on top of all of that, there were conflicting viewpoints on theology with the Presbyterian church, and even within the Presbyterian church. So in the early 1850s, everything came to a boiling point. The leading theologians of the day knew everyone needed to get on the same page and make some real decisions about what Congregationalism was and how it would look moving forward, and whether or not to get out of the union with the Presbyterian church. And with that, a national convention was announced, where all the Congregational churches would come together in a big meeting and talk it out. And here's where it gets interesting, because that convention needed a location, and that location was Albany, New York. So here's what First Congregational Church of Albany looked like in the 1850s. We were brand new, established in 1850, holding services in a 100-year-old building we bought from the Presbyterian Church. In fact, everyone in the city still referred to it as the Old Presbyterian Church. But First Congregational Church of Albany was also the fastest growing church in the city. Membership was rapidly multiplying and featured some of the biggest players on the city's social roster, including a prominent Supreme Court judge, headmaster of the Albany Academy, chair of what was to become Albany Medical Center, and president of the Albany Exchange Bank, just to name drop a few. And to top it all off, the minister of First Congregational Church of Albany was nationally recognized theologian and poet, Reverend Dr. Ray Palmer. Meanwhile, the city of Albany itself was a bustling state capital, the 10th largest city in the nation, centrally located to New England, the western frontier, and the mid-Atlantic, and easily accessible by boat and rail. So on October 7th, 1852, First Congregational Church of Albany personally welcomed nearly 500 clergymen and laymen from 17 states and Canada to its sanctuary. Ministers, academics, even noted abolitionist Reverend Dr. Henry Ward Beecher, who later became one of the most vocal supporters of women's suffrage. Now, 17 states might not sound like a lot until you realize there were only 31 states in the Union at that time. The proceedings lasted only only a few days, with the Albany Argus providing exclusive coverage in both morning and evening editions. Meanwhile, all the leading papers throughout the Union and Canada provided daily updates about the goings-on of this convention. The convention turned out to be a huge success for the denomination, the outcomes of which made an enormous impact on the church we see today. For example, the Congregational Church would dissolve the plan of union with the Presbyterian Church because everyone agreed the Congregational denomination needed to stand on its own. But at the same time, the denomination would explore partnerships with any other denomination seeking cooperation on shared missions. The church would also actively seek out and encourage young men to pursue a calling to the congregational ministry, and the denomination would establish a new fund specifically for the construction of new congregational churches. The initial amount of the fund was set at $50,000. In today's figures, that would equal over $1.6 million. Meanwhile, a subcommittee published plans for churches and parsonages, which included designs by noted architects such as Upjohn, Downing, Renwick, and Wheeler. But when it came to the expansion of the denomination in the South, that's where it got interesting. You see, while the church did want to expand, it didn't want to compromise its core beliefs, one of which was that all men are created equal. So after some debate, the denomination took a rather bold stance and decided they would support existing congregations in the South, but only if those Southern churches use the gospel to point out the wrongs of slavery and advocate for its abolition. If the minister is not permitted to preach against slavery, or the congregation isn't willing to listen, he should, quote, depart out of that city and wipe the dust off his feet as he goes. Now, by itself, that's a pretty impressive convention, but wait, there's more. Because the Albany Argus had a reporter on the inside, sitting in the church among the attendees, providing first-hand accounts of the proceedings of each day. And as you can imagine, many of the more amusing stories never quite made it into the official proceedings. Unfortunately, for over 150 years, the only existing coverage of the convention we did have were those reports and summaries written by theologians well after the convention had ended, naturally looking to put everybody in the most pious light. And sadly, the original articles that appeared in the Albany Argus were thought to have been lost over a century ago. But luckily, we found them in our church archives. An old box uncovered several months ago revealed the original stories published in the Argus and other accounts of the day, copies of which have now been shared with the Congregational Archives in Boston. For example, we've learned that the Congregational delegates invited other churches across Albany to sit in attendance at the convention: Roman Catholic, Episcopalian, Presbyterian, and more. We've also learned that the convention held such significance that the city of Albany surrounded the streets of First Congregational Church with leather so wagon wheels and horse hooves on the cobblestone wouldn't disturb the convention. But in my opinion, one of the greatest stories to come from the Argus came from the very first day. While the convention was selecting its officers, the chair read aloud a telegraph received by the Albany Chief of Police from the New York City Chief of Police. The telegraph warned that a delegation of pickpockets had left New York by boat the previous night with plans to attend the Congregational Convention disguised as clergy to steal what money they could from those in attendance. The telegraph was met with raucous laughter. The committee extended their thanks to the police, and one of the clergymen suggested a vote of sympathy be given to the pickpockets, who thought they could get anything out of a bunch of ministers. Eventually, after a few days, the convention was over, delegates returned home, and Albany rolled up the leather from the streets. But the Albany Convention of 1852 is now considered one of the most important events in the history of the Congregational denomination. Not only did it define and solidify the Congregational denomination as an independent entity, but it also established the Congregational Building Society, set the stage for future conventions, and led to the founding of the National Council of Congregational Churches in 1865. And it all happened in Albany at First Congregational Church. Learn more about our history at firstcongregationalalbany.org.